Pleased to be sitting here with Rudolph Marcus on the 26th of June, the year 2000, which is actually the first day of the Nobel Prize Tagungen in Lindau, which is actually the 50th anniversary of these days here. And let me first ask you, you were actually born in Canada, but your parents were immigrants?
My parents actually were immigrants, yes, but I was born in Canada. My father immigrated from the United States, and my mother immigrated from England, and they happened to meet in Canada. Yes, I'm a child of immigrants.
That's true, but there's many laureates actually are sons or daughters of immigrants.
Right.
Did they encourage you to go into higher studies, or
I think that was the sort of the atmosphere in my family. Now, I'm not sure if you would regard the following as encouragement, but when I was a baby in a carriage, we lived near McGill University, and my mother used to wheel me around in McGill University and tell me that I would be going to McGill University. I suppose that's a form of encouragement.
Surely.
Yes. Now, the fact that two of my father's brothers at the time were in medical school or had just finished medical school at McGill probably was a factor that maybe she thought that maybe I would go to McGill. She never urged me to go into medicine or anything like that, but I think that was a factor. And then I think another factor probably was just the atmosphere of education, partly those two uncles, but partly actually a great uncle whom I never met in Sweden.
Oh, yes.
And what I learned about him is that he had immigrated to Sweden from Lithuania just before the turn of the century, and then later changed his religion and got a doctorate in theology in Uppsala.
Oh.
And what I learned about him was that he could speak 13 languages. Well, of course, that's a kind of encouragement, you know. Then many years later, when I visited Sweden, actually before the prize, I met two of his daughters, visited Sweden, and then asked her about him because he had died in 1945. Asked about him, and I was very disappointed. I learned that no, he could not speak 13 languages, he could only speak 9 languages. But one thing I did learn more, I knew he'd written some books because I had seen a copy of the Swedish Who's Who book from 1939, and his name, in the form of Henrik Steen, was in the book, and had mentioned a number of books that he'd written on theology. And I mean, for a while he was a representative of a Christian group in Jerusalem, actually. Oh, but anyways, he had taught at gymnasium in Vänersburg for many years. So when we went back to Sweden in 1992, I'd asked the sort of guide from the foreign ministry whether she could perhaps learn what books he had written. Oh. And it turned out, much to my surprise, rather than just the few that are mentioned in the Who's Who, that he had written 40 books. So, in a sense, some people might regard that as making up for the 4 missing languages.
No, absolutely, I think so.
So that's sort of the background. Oh. So, and for example, one of my uncles who went in medicine was very good at mathematics, and I, as someone in high school, his sister, my aunt, had given me a book that he'd won, a mathematics prize. So I think there was some mathematical interest in the family, and in that sense, anyway.
Now, you told me that mathematics was actually your favorite.
I enjoyed mathematics just so much. I like the logic of, say, Euclidean geometry, and yes. I mean, whatever we were doing, I just, I mean, certainly that was my favorite thing. Before that, of course, you know, as you know only too well, science is sort of figuring out things, trying to puzzle things out, and I think that some of the work that I've done is related to some things I did when I was a child, and many other children do. For example, as children, we had jigsaw puzzles.
Oh, yeah.
And I used to enjoy putting jigsaw puzzles. In fact, I think one of the theories that I developed was very much like putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And another thing that, as children, many of us like to do, or maybe grade school, possibly early high school, was we had these construction sets, erector sets,
yes.
where you build things, where you work with your hands and you build things. And I think that both of those are perhaps a reflection of the kind of spirit that many of us have in science, and you know, in trying to construct, trying to build. In the case of the mathematics, trying to think through things. And
when you said that, I recollect my own experience with Meccano, which was one is marvelous.
I had a Meccano set too. Yes,
a great invention.
of course, that's
now
right.
it's Lego, I believe, which is taking over from that.
I'm trying to remember. I think in Canada, Meccano came mainly from Britain, and the Erector from U.S., but I don't remember. Yeah, but those certainly were favorite pastimes.
So having McGill University nearby, it meant that you eventually sort
meant
of,
that even though we had very little money, it meant that I could go to university. And in fact, it did charge some tuition. Well, in fact, for high school at that time, tuition was charged. But fortunately, in high school, I won scholarships, so I didn't have to pay. And at McGill, they wanted, at that time, as during the Second World War, accelerate science students to go through and finish and do various work. And so they had some special bursaries that they gave, and so the college education didn't cost anything either. So.
But you were not majoring in mathematics at that.
No,
you were
no.
chemistry.
Those at McGill at the time could major in mathematics and physics. I think that was the choice. There may have been pure mathematics there, but I don't think so. I think, although the courses were pure mathematics, it was sort of math-physics major. That was one alternative. And the other alternative was, for me, was chemistry. I mean, it was just a sort of a choice there. And although I liked mathematics so much, I think the physics that I had in high school sort of turned me off. Later on, when I had electricity and magnetism in college, it was great. You know, I enjoyed that very much. But in high school, I remember all these levers and pulleys, and I mean, no doubt many students found that very easy. But I found it very difficult to translate, and I think that put me off the physics, and probably it's just as well. I say probably just as well because I remember in some of the math classes, although I was a very good student, I know, for example, in the complex variables course, I wasn't first in the class. The student who was first was Louis Nuremberg, who later shared the first Crawford Prize with Arnold. Well, anyway, seeing Louis do these proofs, these mathematical proofs, you know, and the imagination, and the rest of us were sort of, you know, mechanically going away, and he was so imaginative that I'm sure it was a very good move not to go into mathematics.
Well, after McGill, what happened next?
Well, after McGill, there was a chance of applying for a fellowship to go to France. And of course, that would give one a chance to see Europe. It's true I'd been to Europe before because when I was 6 months old, my mother took me to see some of her parents and her family, but I didn't remember much from that time, you see. So this would have been a chance to see Europe. But somehow I felt that was kind of frivolous, you see. And so when somebody came down from the National Research Council of Canada, which was just beginning a postdoctoral program, the NRC, as you know, is in Ottawa, just beginning the postdoctoral program, came down to look for, seek people to apply for fellowships. There are We weren't even, it was before the fellowship program, so we were called junior research officers.
Oh, yes.
But we were doing the same thing that later on fellows did. And so that was such a natural thing. So I sort of just drifted. In fact, I think all along, up to my first few years there, it had really been just sort of flowing, drifting, and not sort of thinking great things or what have you, just flowing naturally. I mean, for example, there's no question it was going to be in science earlier on, but there was a question, was it going to be math and that terrible statics in physics? Or was it going to be chemistry? No. So it ended up being chemistry. But of course, eventually it was the kind of chemistry where I was able to draw in physics, and that played a big role, and draw in a little mathematics.
But you mentioned to me also that theory in Canada was virtually non-existent.
Not only virtually non-existent, but in reality non-existent. In theory in Canada at the time, well, there wasn't a single theorist in all of Canada. Now there are many theorists, but at that time there were none. And so when we had courses, even though there was some theory described in some of the courses, it was theory described by experimentalists who were not as sophisticated as experimentalists like you, knowing theory. But the experimentalists at that time were much less sophisticated. And so the people did their best, probably did a very good job, but we really didn't have that much background. So it was natural for me when I went up to Canada to do experimental work as I'd done for my bachelor's degree. And then, but after 2 or so years, I became dissatisfied inside because although I enjoyed sort of working with my hands, there was something missing. In particular, things that I'd learned in mathematics, I could hardly apply, and in fact, really not apply. So and I became increasingly conscious that I was missing something. You know, at the time, for example, when I was at McGill, and I took a course in complex variables, and all the other students were math physics majors, they had courses in potential theory, where they would be applying their complex theory. I had nowhere to apply it. No. So I really felt something was missing inside. And then a friend and I, he was also a postdoctoral working with Stacy. A friend and I decided we would form a 2-man seminar in which it was like the blind leading the blind. I would describe a theoretical paper to him, then the next time he would describe one to me. You know, we'd try to learn theory that way. Wow. And then ultimately apply it to reactions that we were actually measuring the rates of. So that was the first time that we had to read the literature for that, the theoretical literature. And that was the first time that I was really conscious of theory as being a living subject. And I began to think, and this was the first initiative that I really showed, that maybe I could try for a postdoctoral in theory. I had 5.5 years of experimental background. Maybe I could try for a postdoctoral.
And you made
so I applied to half a dozen people. Of course, most of the people weren't interested. I mean, here's somebody with no theoretical background, you know, unknown, and what have you. And so not all of the 6 replied, but some of them did, and they said, well, one of them suggested I apply to the Institute for Advanced Studies. Well, who's going to take me? And so on. And another, no. Well, another one wondered if I could maybe help guide his experimental group when I was in sabbatical. That was obviously not good. But then one of them, Oscar Rice, said that if he would apply for an Office of Naval Research grant, and if he got the grant, then I could come down as a postdoctoral. And this was in the early days. This was before the National Science Foundation. The Office of Naval Research was a real pioneer in the U.S. in support of basic research. He applied for the grant, he got the grant, and I went down. And working with him was just marvelous. I mean, as an individual, he was gentle, he was thoughtful of everybody, of broader issues, and he was exceedingly smart. I mean, he really examined things in detail. He was imaginative. He was an early person in reaction dynamics in the 1930s. In fact, around 1936, I guess there was a choice who was going to get the tenure position at Harvard, Rice or Bright Wilson. Bright Wilson was in structure, he was in dynamics. Bright Wilson got the position, Rice then went on to Carolina. But he turned out to be a marvelous choice. One of the things that, looking back, I think was just so wonderful, is that for the first 3 months, essentially I knew no theory. For the first 3 months, I just read things. But we had sort of a two-man seminar.
Yeah.
And I would, once a week, well, I would see him more often than that, but once a week, I would describe to him some paper that I had read, theoretical paper, and he would point out assumptions maybe that I had overlooked. But it was that kind of almost selfless guidance. And that continued for quite a while. After 3 months, he gently suggested that maybe it'd be a good idea to work on some particular problem.
Yes.
And then he suggested, there is this field of unimolecular reactions. And I had made a measurement of a unimolecular decomposition of a free radical. So and some other stuff. So I knew something about the experiment. And so he made that suggestion. So that was fine. And I read every paper that I could possibly relate to that theoretical paper. Some papers were in German. My German was very small, but I probably learned as much German during the time I spent on the postdoc as I did learn chemistry, you see. Anyways, in fact, I still have a word-by-word translation of one of Landau's famous papers that I wanted to try to understand. So he suggested that I work on the concrete problem. So I ended up with not being conscious of trying to develop a big theory or anything like that, but just trying to understand the sort of unimolecular composition better. And the previous work that had been done in the field had been done many years earlier, in the 1920s, before quantum mechanics came into chemistry. So what they did in the 1920s was wonderful, but it was limited by knowing nothing about structures, what have you. So what I ended up doing was putting little bits and pieces together. You remember I mentioned jigsaw puzzles.
Yes.
And that was it. I mean, I took the ideas of the theory of the 1920s, the statistical ideas. Then there are various things that have been done related to transition state theory. Some were right, some were wrong. The ones that were wrong or that I thought were wrong, I threw away. The right ones, I brought in. So I brought in these pieces, and without realizing it, I developed a theory.
Yeah.
I mean, it really didn't come out as a great thing, a great plan. But I developed the theory. And then a year or two later, I refined it, but his idea paid off, because the first 3 months were study, the next 3 months was development of the theory. So that was it. And later that theory became widely used, known as RRKM theory.
Famous theory.
And that, but I mean, I thought it was interesting. It's an example of where something is developed sort of, in a sense, unexpectedly. Trying to just build on some things that have been done before, but then putting together in a way that something a bit different comes out.
You mentioned to me also sometime that you resent the attitude of some supervisors to regard students as a pair of hands rather than, say,
that's right. One thing I remember so much about Oscar Rice was that for him, I think, the student in his development or her development was primary. As Stacy, when I worked with him, didn't regard students as a pair of hands. I mean, we worked on interesting projects. Winkler, who had a large number of students, and with whom I had done my doctorate, doctoral studies, didn't regard students as a pair of hands. In fact, the students almost worshipped Winkler. It was just wonderful interaction. And probably that's true in many cases nowadays, but there's such pressure to, in some cases, to produce a lot of publications that the time to get a PhD is longer, and sometimes I wonder whether in some cases the students are mainly a pair of hands. In some cases, they mechanically go through something, whether it's using a computer program or using an apparatus. Now, I'm sure in many, many cases, there's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes in, both on the part of the student and the supervisor, but there certainly seem to be a number of these cases which are not really that.
True. Well, you eventually ended up at Caltech, and this is quite a place, I would say, with quite a number of Nobel Prizes.
Right. Of course, the history of getting there is a rather long one.
Yeah.
I didn't go straight from
I understand
to Caltech. I don't know, you might be interested in a little of the history.
Absolutely,
some of which you know.
Yes.
I mean, for example, when I was going to be finishing up with the doctorate at Caltech, well, 6 months after I got down there, I not only had developed RE-chem theory, but I got married too.
That's okay.
I met a charming North Carolina girl. Yes. We got married 6 months later. So really, at some point after being down there for about 2 years, I had to, I wanted to try to find a job of some sort. And I applied to quite a few universities. As I've often said, I applied to 35 universities. That was a lot at that time. I didn't get 35 no's because not everyone replied. But none of them said yes. So then I looked into possible postdoctorals. And there would have been 2 possibilities. Not definite, but I had begun to explore them. One was with Fritz London, who was nearby at Duke University, but that would have been a little bit too much on the physics side. Another was with Robert Mulliken that I'd begun to explore. But I really didn't want to go on another postdoctoral. I really wanted to start teaching. So I went with a friend to an American Chemical Society meeting, and at that meeting they had a kind of a job fair, and it turned out that somebody from the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn was looking for faculty members. Now, Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn was not one of the 35. I had not heard of it. I hadn't applied to it. Anyways, he was looking. And it also turned out that during the time I was at Carolina, Oscar Rice had got ill. And eventually it was the illness which maybe 20 years later led to his death. But he got ill. And for some time, I taught his courses. And I think it was one course a turn that I was teaching. And one of the students in that class had formerly been a student at the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, had happened to meet Dean Kirk, who was looking for young faculty members. He mentioned to Kirk that I taught these classes, and then an interview was arranged, and Kirk asked me very few questions. The one I remember was, "Do you like young people?" Yeah. Well, I was young. I was sort of surprised. I said, "Yes, I like young people." Anyways, they invited me up for an interview, and then I was given the position, and that's where I got started, and that's where most of the electron transfer work was in fact done. And it's interesting that the Polytechnic at that time was not a well-known school. It had very little endowment, but what it did have was young people who were extremely active. And so the atmosphere was great. It was a polymer center. Herman Mark actually was there. So, I mean, he wasn't that young, but he was the center. He was one of the catalysts. There were several other people who had come over from Europe who were well known, who were there. And it was extremely strong in electrical engineering, microwaves. There was a microwave research institute for that. But it turned out that this chemistry department was full of a bunch of eager beavers. So the atmosphere was just, exciting. And even though some of us were not in polymers, the fact that so many very well-known people came through, leading people in the field because of the Polymer Institute, came through to give talks, that sort of added to the excitement. So for me, it turned out that that was a great place to get started. And in fact, the electron transfer work, for which I eventually got the prize, the electron transfer work got started, in a sense, because of some question that a student in one of my classes in statistical mechanics asked. He asked a question about the application of some of the ideas to polyelectrolytes, these long chain molecules with a lot of charges, which were being actively studied there and other places and so on. And he asked about whether some theory could be applied to them. And so I did a lot of reading related to that, and eventually wrote 2 papers on polyelectrolytes. But in the course, had read many books on electrostatics, so how do you formulate things? There were 3 different expressions in the literature for the free energy of the system. Are these expressions different, or are they equivalent? So I did a lot of reading, and showed they were equivalent, but showed other things. So when accidentally I came across this paper by Willard Libby, who later got the Nobel Prize for radiocarbon dating, on electron transfer reactions and on an unusual explanation, and having a back-of-the-envelope electrostatic calculation form, I was so excited because it was clear that his basic idea of what's involved in trying to explain some of the experimental data, the basic idea was right, but there was something that felt strange about his follow-up of the idea. Something was missing. And this back-of-the-envelope calculation was the thing that clued me in because of all this thing background that I'd had in electrostatics. And then I realized what was missing. I think it means as much today as it did then, violation of the law of conservation of energy.
I would say.
That's right. And so the question was, how could one bring in that striking thing that Libby had brought in, but not violate the law of conservation of energy? And I saw what happened, that before an electron could jump from one molecule to another, all of the molecules around the first thing had to be prepared for the jump. And all of those had to be prepared for the jump there. And then the electron could jump. And so the problem became, how do you calculate, how to prepare? But the thing is that my entrance into the field of electron transfer was a series of, you might say, coincidences or accidents. I mean, having to read that paper, having to see, because of the electrostatic background that I had acquired for a different reason, that there was something wrong. And then putting 2 together, it was a kind of jigsaw puzzle.
There is one special thing about today, because today, the 26th of June, the year 2000, there's been a joint announcement by groups in the United States and Britain and elsewhere about the first published, I would say, almost draft, not completely, but the human genome is now sort of put officially on paper so that everyone can study it and read it and look at it. So there has been even a joint discussion between Bill Clinton and Tony Blair about this event, and scientists said that this is a major event in the history of mankind, actually, in the history of science. Would you like to comment about this?
Yes, of course, everything in that field is far from my own.
I know.
But one thing has been clear over the years is how much biology is drawing upon chemistry and physics, so that in a sense, biology has become so much more molecular. And now with the Human Genome Project and the business of understanding the genes and understanding disease on a molecular basis, I think the future for young people is just immense.
Yes.
I mean, I know a little bit about certain narrow corners of biology. And I'm excited by those corners. So imagine, with a broad area. I mean, one of the wonderful things, and of course the Nobel Committee has recognized this, one of the wonderful things is how some of these complex structures have become known, determined. And of course, to understand some of these biological processes, or to understand any chemical reaction, you have to know something about structure as a starting point. Now in chemistry, for simple molecules, that's well understood. I mean, automatically we assume we know what the starting structures are, and what the final, we don't know the intermediates that we learn about. But the starting we know. Well, before this, in the biological area, as you know, not much was known in detail about structure, but now so much is being known. Like, for example, the prize on photosynthesis and how that fitted into the detailed studies of reaction mechanisms involving photosynthesis, or the transfer of energy that's picked up from the sunlight to this photosynthetic reaction center, the structural information there. Or very recently with the prize for the ATP synthase, how nature's smallest rotary engine.
Exactly.
I mean, what a wonderful device, what an exciting device to have in one little sort of unit. An ion current going across, an electric field being applied, something rotating, and in the process forming ATP, which is such an important agent. I mean, and of course, these rotary motors and linear motors are sort of ubiquitous. So, I mean, there's surely plenty of excitement. I know there are already quite a few experiments, of course, but I mean, I think that the things are just opening up. What we have learned so far in the basic level for basic understandings has so many potentialities for applying to these more complex systems. You know, are we going to be able to use the same rules, or is there going to be a kind of simplification? For example, in protein folding, is somebody going to come out with something which says, you don't need everything at this complete level of detail, but this is the broad outline. And if you understand that, you've understood a sense. I mean, maybe I have no idea. It's not my area. I don't know. But I think there's so many possibilities. Of course, that's one area. Okay, and certainly the genome is going to expand it into molecular medicine, which is already very active. But of course, there are other frontiers where physics and chemistry and mathematics meet, you know, and do construct all sorts of things, nanostructures, molecular computers eventually, goodness knows what. I think it's exciting for young people to have these opportunities. But of course, there's been an excitement for a long time.
It has.
Many of us were excited
Absolutely.
by it. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Marcus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.